Could have been more. Okay, we're on air. Excellent. What we did, are you still there, Paul?
Yeah.
What I did last week is I put in a Zoom link and we went to a discussion. So we had like 5 or 10 minutes after I started the Q&A, I just typed in, we have 11 participants. I typed in a Zoom address and about 6 or 8 of us just discussed for the next half hour, but it was, open forum.
Oh, that's awesome.
So that worked. I may do that again. Yeah. All right, we have 12 people. Hello, everybody. I assume that a few of you are hearing my voice. In less than 5 minutes, I'm going to go over to sharing screen and starting the PowerPoint. Just so you know, this is the second of 2 classes. This is the last class. The PowerPoint is now available, I believe, on your screen. There's a thing for a file or something like that. So if you look, the file Is There a God? So you can get the PowerPoint that I'll be using. If you're interested in the book, which I wrote a number of years ago on this topic, it's called Is There a God? It's available at IPI Books, Illumination Publishers. Thanks to Paul Vasquez for putting on this event. Really appreciate that. Very good. So the way this is going to work, I'll repeat myself, but for those who are here a little early. So I'm going to start probably 3 or 4 minutes after 9, my local time. I'm going to go for at least an hour and 15 minutes, maybe a bit more. And then what you can do is you can put questions into the chat. Okay, put questions into the chat. And at the end of the session, I'll go through all of those questions, answer them. And what we did last week is we actually opened up a Zoom channel for those who wanted to actually, kind of have a back and forth conversation. All right, so that's the way it's going to work. It's about 1 minute past 9. We have 25 people, which is great. Paul, do you want to say anything to our guests here?
Well, we do have that. There's an offers tab that's on your phone or device. If you want to get the book right now, it's 20% off.
Nice.
And great job, John.
I just had a new book published this week. It's the Spanish translation version of my book on Daniel. Daniel, Profeta para las Naciones, now available. Another book, Razones para Creer, Reasons for Belief, should be out within a month or so, also in Spanish. And then my book From Shadow to Reality is a bit behind, but it should come up pretty soon as well. All right, so I can't think of any reason not to start sharing screen and going over to the file. Plus, Paul's around, so he can make sure I'm doing it right. So I go here, share, and then I do that. So is it working now, Paul? Can people see it? All right, I hope people are seeing it. I'm going to ask Paul by cell phone, and then we'll get the class started. Okay, so here we go. Those of you who are coming in, we're starting the class. I'm just making sure everything's working by calling Paul. We're going to be going for about an hour and 15 minutes, then we'll take a Q&A session.
Yes,
Is it working?
What?
Can you hear me and see the screen?
So I just went to the restroom for a second.
People are hearing you right now. So can you both hear me and see me right now so I can start the class? Sorry about that, Paul.
No, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Paul. And you can hang out if you want, or, you're free to go. But talk to you soon.
Thanks, John.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the class. Like I said, I'm going to go for about an hour 15, hour and 20 minutes. And then we'll, if you have questions, type them in the chat. I won't see the questions until I'm done with the class. So at the end of the lecture, an hour 15, hour 20 from now, something like that, I'll then go through all the questions that come into the chat. And then after that, I'm going to open up a Zoom channel so we can have more of a extended conversation for those who are interested. Okay? So we're now officially starting the class. Here we go. All right, so here's our outline. Last week we did a discussion of science and religion. We talked about what kinds of questions science seems to do a good job of answering, what kind of questions religion in general and Christianity more specifically is good at answering, and trying to establish some ground rules for the kinds of questions we should probably give science the first go at, and the kinds of questions we should give religion or special revelation or those kinds of things. All right, and using the advice of Galileo, the Bible was written to tell us how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. We decided that probably in matters related to where, when, by what means, these kinds of things, science should get the first go because that's what it's good at. But in questions of purpose, meaning, value, the supernatural, those kind of questions, what's right and wrong, the Bible should be the starting point. Okay? I did a little thing on the history of science and Christianity. We showed how science itself is the result of Christianity, but we also showed how over the centuries it evolved to the place that, at least for a certain segment of our society, of our culture, science began to be a thing that seemed to remove the need for religion, for Christianity. And then there was the Christian backlash in the 20th century with the young earth creationism and the basically rejection of science, although they didn't say that, and they said quite the opposite. That's the reality, which happened with the young earth creationist movement. We talked about the Christian response, a good Christian way to approach these kind of things. Then I spent a fair amount of time on the age of the universe, and we established that the universe appears to be about 13.5 billion years old based on a number of lines of evidence. Then we talked about the age of the Earth, and I showed the evidence that seems to support quite strongly that the Earth itself is around 4.5 billion years old. Okay, and then we started talking about Genesis 1 and creation. Didn't quite finish that, but I described different possibilities. I'm just going to go ahead to those slides here, and then we'll do our class for today, which is basically science and the Bible, and science and Christianity, etc. Okay, great. Aha. So we're going to talk about evolution, of course, and we're going to talk about the flood. So here's what we were doing when time ran out. I talked about Genesis 1, and I pointed out more than one possible view of Genesis 1. Okay, there's the young earth theory. I described two versions of that. One, the young earth theory, which is the young earth theory, the Earth is young, number one, and number two, that science agrees with that. And I dismissed that view as being totally untenable, bordering on ridiculous. And I apologize to those who have that view, but science simply does not present any support to the idea that the Earth is young. There is none. People say there is, but I'm sorry, they're wrong. But then another young Earth view is the idea that God created the Earth and the universe to appear young. God could do that if he wanted to. I don't think that idea is stupid or ridiculous or not even necessarily wrong. I'm sort of agnostic on that. The problem is almost nobody will support that view, partly because they want to appear scientific, but also because it creates some interesting philosophical questions like why would God seemingly almost deceive us by making it appear as if there's a star 2 billion light years away. All right. Anyway, then there's the day-age model, which is the one that I favor, but I don't say is the right one. The idea that day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 represent not a single 24-hour day. It represents spans of time over which God did his work. And so it preserves at least some historical content. First this, then this, then this. By the way, I made it clear all these different views have problems, and that came out in our question and answer session. Then the framework model, which friends of mine who are faithful disciples and understand science, basically it's the idea that there's essentially no actual historical content there, so the content is thematic. So day 1 through 3 describe heavens, seas, and land and life. And then day 4, 5, and 6, heavens, seas, and land and life. And so it's entirely a sort of a framework, and it's somewhat accommodational, seemingly. Generally, people who go with the framework model are accommodationists in that they say that that the Genesis account includes untrue information, essentially. So I'm skeptical of the framework theory, but I think it's possible. In fact, there may be elements of day, age, and framework in the reality. We'll find out at Judgment Day time, okay? So there's 3 possible models that I believe work with both the science and the Bible, which is the young earth, but in appearance of age, the day age theory, and the framework model. Then I went through the day age theory, talked about the details of the Genesis account, and showed that with some possible problems that could be brought up, that basically the details that are contained in this model are consistent with what I know from science if we allow the lengths of time to be metaphorical. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is the idea of whether it's a myth. Now, I'm going to say something that may bother you, but I believe that the Genesis 1 account and even the Genesis 2 account, the other creation account, do meet most, if not all, qualifications for what we would call a myth. So the way I try to describe it is Genesis 1 is a true myth. Now, in the normal meaning of the word myth to the typical English speaker in the Western world, a myth is a story which is basically not true. But let me give a definition of a myth. A myth is a simplified story given to explain the gods or God to common men. So it's a simplified story in order to present truth about the gods, or in the Bible, about the God, about Jehovah. And so there are many creation myths. In fact, all ancient cultures had creation myths, all of them. As far as I know, I don't know of any exceptions. So the difference is, and we'll look at some of the creation myths. The difference is the other creation myths contain silly facts that nobody could actually take seriously at all. I mean, they're obviously myth in the sense of tells a story, but the story is actually not true. Whereas the Bible's myth, if you will, creation myth, seems to have details that are not inconsistent with science really at all. All right. In fact, many people view Genesis 1 as a polemic against the Babylonian Sumerian creation myth. So there's the Babylonian creation myth, which has the idea of this primeval swamp. And then there's a battle between the god Marduk and the god Tiamat. Marduk kills Tiamat, and Marduk becomes the main god of the Babylonian pantheon. And the blood from the death of Tiamat mixed with the mud and creates the first humans. In the Babylonian creation myth, humans are an afterthought. They're not the purpose of it. They're an afterthought. And a human's role is essentially to feed or to serve the gods. All right. Then there's the Egyptian creation myth. There's this primeval ocean, this flat area. Both myths have the earth being flat. There's this primeval ocean, and this island, the Nun, emerges from that ocean. It becomes the primeval hill from which all life emerges. And of course, that hill is near the location of Thebes today. The Greek creation myth, Prometheus and Epimetheus form clay molds, and from those clay molds, they make human beings. The earth is supported by Atlas, holding it up. The earth is flat. Iroquois creation myth, Enegorio and Enego Hahet, Gaia, good and evil brothers, battle, all these things. So the bottom line is these ancient myths include details that nobody could actually take serious to be true at all. In fact, I wonder if the ancient peoples even took them to be true. They were just pictures kind of describe what's going on in the world. All right, so Genesis 1, I believe, is a clear breaking away from that pattern because it doesn't have creatures killing each other and bizarre details that are not believable in any way. In fact, the Genesis creation myth even minimizes the role of the sun and the moon. It doesn't even call them sun and moon and stars. It just says heavenly objects. Again, you see this polemic against the Babylonian creation myth. So here's an engraving of Marduk killing Tiamat. The blood falls to the ground, creating human beings. The Egyptian creation myth, which is kind of bizarre. That's a very odd picture. Here's a picture depicting the Iroquoian creation myth of Enigo Hata, what's his name, going after these other people. All right. So I believe, and to summarize here is, to me, my picture of the Genesis account is it's a myth in the sense that the primary purpose of the Genesis account is to tell us about God, helps us understand the nature of God. God turns chaos into cosmos. God created everything. He's creating order out of disorder. But in the Genesis creation account, the ultimate purpose of that creation is that God is creating us. And then as we get into Genesis 2 and 3, we realize the reason for that is because God wants a relationship with us. And God didn't create us so that we could just sort of be subservient to him. He created us to have a relationship with him. All right, now, next question is this idea of the days not being literal 24 hours, is that a tenable idea? Is that a reasonable interpretation? And I guess that's in the eyes of the beholder. But some people have said this is just an excuse that Christians have created this idea. In other words, it's an ad hoc theory. In other words, all Christians believed the earth was young until science says it was old. And then they created this day-age model, not because it agreed with what the Bible says, but so that they don't have to abandon their Christianity. And I would say in response to that, that's not true. It is literally not true. The reason I know that is long before the scientific age, Jews and Christians alike all proposed that the story essentially was what I would call a true myth, that it contained metaphorical or allegorical aspects to it, and they didn't take the days literally. Examples would be Philo, the Jewish theologian, arguably the most important Jewish author in the first century, right in the time of Christ. Origen, from the late 2nd, early 3rd century. Augustine from the late 4th, early 5th century. Thomas Aquinas. Now, not all the early church fathers took these stories to be metaphorical and assumed the time span was much greater. Some took them literally, some didn't. The evidence is there was a mixture of perspective in the early church. But here's what I'm saying. The idea that these days are not literal, but that they should be taken from more metaphorically or allegorically, is something that has been present from the very inception of Christianity, and it is not an ad hoc hypothesis created as an excuse, essentially, to save the creation account. I believe the creation account. I believe it's true. I believe science supports, at least broadly, that conclusion. By the way, the word yom, the day, is translated many, many different ways in the Old Testament. It's generally translated literally as day, but in Isaiah 42 it says, "In the day that the branch of the Lord will be, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful." So even there, that day is certainly not literal at all. It says the day means that period of time. In fact, we happen to be living in the day that Isaiah 42 is talking about. Sometimes it's translated as time or today or forever or continuously. Now, be honest about it. The obvious interpretation of Genesis 1, evening, morning, the first day, the obvious interpretation is literal 24-hour periods. And so those who take the day age or the framework model need to acknowledge that because a rule of hermeneutics is generally the obvious interpretation is the correct one. And yet, honest, sincere believers have taken a different view in this case, including myself. I don't completely dismiss as dumb or stupid or ignorant the young Earth model. I already explained that, but anyway. So I'm going to move on. Honestly, to me, this is not a faith changing important question. All right. Now I have to talk about the flood. All right. And the young Earth creationists, you can read their books, the creation flood, etc., by Wickham and Morris. And they try to create this idea that the flood happened, whatever 6,000 years ago, and that it occurred soon after the universe was created, and then the Grand Canyon and every geologic feature, all the fossil layers were created during this flood. Again, I'm sorry, excuse me, but that idea is ridiculous. It certainly is ridiculous, because if you look at the fossils, you'll see the older fossils are farther down, the younger fossils are farther up. The order is always maintained. You never see human fossils or saber-toothed tigers underneath dinosaurs. You never see trilobites above dinosaurs. This idea is just simply untenable. All right, so just like with the creation account, with the flood account, there's different options. One option is just to say it's just a myth with no basis whatsoever. It's just a completely invented story with no historical value at all. Simply a fable, which is like a myth, to tell something about God, but it's not something that actually happened. To me, that's a problem for several reasons. We'll talk about that. And then for those who believe the flood did in fact happen, there's two versions. There's the worldwide flood and the local flood. And I have friends who believe in the Bible and believe the Bible's fully inspired by God. And they support the local flood idea. It doesn't make sense to me that the water would rise to many, many feet locally, and generally water flows downhill. So it couldn't last for 150 days if it's purely a local flood. But, we can have discussions about this. Honestly, I'll be honest with you, I don't care. I believe the flood happened. I'm going to give you a few reasons why I believe it did. But I'll tell you this, the principal reason I believe in the flood is because the inspired word of God, and Jesus as an interpreter of it, says it happened. And I believe it. All right? So even within the worldwide flood model, there's the young Earth creationist view, which is that it's all scientific and it happened recently. And there's some sort of pseudo-scientific explanation of that. And the other idea is this worldwide event happened at a certain time in the past, and it was a completely miraculous cause of it, and then a miraculous, essentially, end of it. All right. So did all this happen in did the entire geologic history of the Earth kind of get created in a single cataclysmic event? And my response to that is definitely not. Go ahead and take a visit to, this is Bryce Canyon, which I believe is in southern Utah. You can see the different rocks, the different ages, the Mesozoic, the Cenozoic, the different, periods, eras, all those sorts of things. And I would say, if you look at the geologic record, that this proposal that this is all the result of some big flood is silly, and it makes Christianity look silly. And I beg our young Earth creationists to stop doing this. Okay? If you believe the Earth is young and God created it to appear old, with the layers all tumbled up and turned up on weird sides and angles, all right? And then there's this idea that there's some sort of kind of semi-scientific explanation. There's the canopy theory, that all this water was held up in the atmosphere and then suddenly it fell to the Earth in some sort of pseudo-natural event. Doesn't make any sense at all. There is no natural explanation. The idea of the deep, the water in the deep sort of splitting up. And you can read books by young earth creationists with all these things. I've read many, many books like this, and I find them like, I can't take them seriously at all. And imagine giving those to say a teenager or a college student and asking them to read that and use that as the basis to support your interpretation of the Bible and science. Bad idea. Bad idea. I don't think we should do that. But I tell you this, I believe there was a massive flood whose purpose is in line with what the Bible describes. And let me tell you why. I already said the principal reason I believe in the biblical account of the flood is because it's a biblical account. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but it just so happens that there are three myths common to nearly all cultures, ancient cultures, and that's a creation myth, a flood myth, and a God-man myth. Creation myth, all ancient cultures. Flood myths, virtually all ancient cultures. God-man myth, many, many ancient cultures. And the Bible has a creation myth, but it's one which is true to, although it's not a scientific account, it's true to the information. The Bible has a flood myth, which, unlike the others, doesn't have this flowery, bizarre, strange details that nobody can really actually believe, all right, which seems to be a simple account of what may have actually happened. And the same thing with the God-man myths, because Hindu has this God-man myth, Egyptian religion has this God-man myth, Greek religion has its God-man myth, and the Bible has its God-man myth, and it's a true myth because that's Jesus, that God became a human being. So you can see on the screen, this is by far not a complete list. You'll see South America, North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Oceania, every part. And all of these myths have certain elements. I'm probably slightly exaggerating the amount of similarity, but all of them explain this event as some sort of a judgment from the gods or God. All of them imply a worldwide effect, not a local effect. As far as I know, there might be an exception. I'm acting as if I know every single one of these myths in detail. That was not true. But the ones that I've looked into, they all have that element. And in all of them, some humans are saved from that flood by some sort of miraculous or maybe natural sort of event. So it makes me begin to believe that the reason is that every culture has a flood myth is because every surviving human culture has a memory of an actual flood that happened. And to me, that's evidence that that event was worldwide. But it also says to me that probably the result of this flood was devastation worldwide, but that there were remnant populations of animals and plants worldwide. And which would explain why there's people in South America that seem to have some sort of memory of some sort of massive water event. Now, I'm not going to call this a scientific thing, because if quintillions or whatever of gallons of cubic meters of water were to appear, it seems like this would be something that God did directly. I believe that God is going to intervene in our physical world directly at some point in the future as well. Like the Bible says, not a flood, but fire. What does that mean exactly? I don't know. So I believe the flood happened. I don't know when it happened, but I believe it happened. All right. Another reason I believe it happened is because clearly Jesus believed it happened. Matthew 24, 38 through 39. 2 Peter 3 says, just like what happened in the days of Noah, so it will be at the end of time. And if it indeed did not happen as in the days of Noah, because there was not even a person named Noah, then what's the assurance that Jesus will come back? Now, I realize this is not a scientific argument. This is a biblical argument, but I've already confessed to you that I believe the flood happened. The foremost reason I believe it happened is because it's found in the inspired Word of God. And the evidence for inspiration is overwhelming to the point where, to me, it borders on irrational to not believe the Bible is inspired by God. All right. So that's the last point on the screen there. All right. So in fact, I want to make it just a mini comment before I go on to my next point, which is when we're approaching things that are in the Bible, I think we should train ourselves to ask, why do I believe this? There are certain things that are mentioned in the Bible that I believe not only because they're in the Bible, but because of the evidence that I have, even external to the Bible. There's other things that are found in the Bible, and I believe they're true simply because they're in the Bible. Let me give an example of the latter, David and Goliath. The reason I believe that David killed Goliath is only one reason. It's because the story is in the inspired word of God. But the reason I believe God created the universe is because of the evidence and the Bible. The reason I believe that God created life is because of the evidence in the Bible. The reason I believe the Bible inspired by God is because of the evidence. The reason I believe in the resurrection of Jesus is because of the evidence. But the reason I believe the Holy Spirit lives in me is because the Bible says so. The reason I believe that we will be raised from the dead, and tomorrow we're celebrating that, right, is because it says so in the Bible. And the reason I believe in the flood, first and foremost, but not the only reason, it's kind of a mixed thing, is because it's in the Bible. Okay? So that's my dealing with essentially kind of Genesis and science. Feel free to ask questions. I'm doing a really quick version of this. Okay, I want to get to the stuff about science in the Bible. That's really great stuff. But I want to talk really briefly about evolution. All right, what does the Bible say about evolution? Nothing. The Bible gives clear and unmistakable credit to the creation of all species and all life to God himself, obviously. All right, but does the Bible specify in scientific detail how that happened? No. The Bible just says that God did it. And so the way I like to think about it is, if God invented evolution, why don't we give him credit for it instead of sort of getting defensive about it? This is silly. All right, so I'm going to talk about the evidence that supports the theory of evolution. Remember, I said earlier, last Saturday, science cannot say that evolution is true. What we can say from science is that the theory of evolution in its modern form is consistent with all, or at least nearly all, the evidence we have at hand, and it has broad predictive powers consistent with the evidence. Therefore, the theory of evolution is a very, very sound and good theory. Does that mean it explains the formation of all species from the original whatever bacteria? No, it just means it's consistent. So let's talk about the evidence that underlies the theory of evolution. All right, Christians have tried to set evolution up as sort of somehow the product of Satan and the enemy of Christianity. People who believe in evolution, you have to decide, do you believe in evolution or do you believe in God? I believe this is a false dichotomy. I believe it's a dangerous and wrong dichotomy. And I wish people would stop doing that, honestly. I really do. Now, I'll have to say, if you believe in the young earth idea, then you do have to reject evolution. That for some reason, God created life consistent with the evolution theory, the data which I'll show you, which God could do whatever he wants. It's not for me to say. All right, so so there's the theory of evolution itself, created by Darwin, not based on DNA evidence. For sure, they didn't even know about DNA. And Darwin's theory was not even based on fossil evidence, which was very thin back in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. He based his argument for evolution from the existence of current species. He argued common descent of current living species. So let's talk about common descent. There is some fossil evidence. Now, I believe that atheists is sort of the angry, sort of anti-religion people. I think they sometimes exaggerate how strong the fossil evidence is for evolution. But I would say this: over time, if evolution is a good theory, then over time the fossil evidence should fill in and not make it less believable. And that's a fact. The bottom line is the gaps in the fossil record are much bigger than the data. Okay. Yet, nevertheless, despite the fact that the fossil evidence is only modestly supportive of the theory of evolution. In general, it is supportive, and it never seems to go against the theory of evolution, at least with a little bit of explanation with punctuated equilibrium I'll talk about. So I would say, broadly, the fossil evidence is in agreement with, although not like super strong proof of the kind of the big, all species evolving from some common ancestor. Okay, there's the different supposed lines of descent for elephants and their relatives, and for the horse. Again, some of these arguments are maybe exaggerated in how complete they are, but the bottom line is there's pretty decent evidence that whales evolved from land creatures. The evidence is strong enough to say that's probably the most likely explanation. Same thing with the different elephant versions and the whole horse evolution thing. But the bottom line is, in the fossil evidence, there's significant reason to question a simplistic, fully naturalistic evolution view. There's the Cambrian explosion. I'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, well, I'll talk about that when I get there. In fact, the gaps are so large. And for example, there's been a thing that we could call a crocodile for 230 million years, and they seem to have changed very little. So the evidence is things go like this, maybe change a little bit, and then shoom, and so evolution seems to be, if the evolution theory is true, then the evidence shows bizarre, very, very rapid changes with vast periods of very, very small changes. And so this has forced evolutionists to come up with explanations that punctuated equilibrium, certain causes, like a single gene change will happen, which produces this massive and sudden burst of evolution. The bottom line is the fossil evidence has significant problems. All right, to the point that if we simply looked at the fossil evidence, those who are skeptical of the theory of evolution, maybe not everything about it, but certain aspects of it, certain naturalistic aspects of it, they have a point. So I'm going to tell you my personal view is that God created life in the fairly distant past, that God has probably, this is just my opinion, God has essentially God has intervened in that process at various times. The Cambrian explosion being the strongest evidence of God not simply sitting back and, whatever happens, happens. I just set it up. It's going on its own, which is kind of deistic evolution, versus theistic evolution, which is God sort of intervening in that process. We put on a forum about 6 or 7, maybe 8 years ago now, where 4 Christian views of evolution. Somebody, a fully deistic, God not intervening at all. God does intervene, and this is consistent with science and theology. That's me. Intelligent design person, I talked about that earlier, John Clayton, good friend. And then we had a young earth creationist in there who kind of looked foolish, honestly. All right, so this is about the Cambrian explosion, roughly 440 million years ago. Virtually, basically, all 5 Animophyla appear simultaneously in practically 0 time. If this is, say, 435 million years ago, if you go to 450 million years ago, nothing even remotely like these creatures even existed. All right, so there's evidence of massive creation of species that are alive. I believe it's because God did that. He chose at different times and different places to do certain things. That's not a scientific idea. That's a religious idea. Here's a picture of kind of the whole time span, and somewhere around 460 million years ago, roughly, there's this massive appearance of all these. 530 million years ago, there's the massive appearance of all these interesting phyla. All right. So anyway, bottom line is the fossil evidence generally supportive, but not really strong proof. But then there's the genetic evidence, and I will say this: the genetic evidence very strongly supports the idea of common descent. Okay, for example, you're looking at human, chimp, gorilla, and orangutan chromosomes. Humans have 23 of 46 chromosomes. The others have 24 or 48. And yet, if you align human chromosome number 2 with ape chromosome 2A and 2B, you can see agreement. So this explains, for example, why it is that different species have different chromosomes. Because events seem to occur very, very rarely in which the number of chromosomes can actually change. What am I saying? Am I saying that the evidence for common descent of humans and the other great apes from some common ancestor is strong? The answer is yes, it's pretty strong. All right. Examples of genetic evidence that seems to support common descent are things like pseudogenes. Let me give one example. Of all mammals, the only mammals that do not produce vitamin C are humans, bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and guinea pigs. And there was a mutation that seems to have occurred. The evidence supports this. Sorry about my phone. There seems to have been a mutation that happened sometime, probably several million years ago, that caused all those species to not produce vitamin C. We have the gene for vitamin C, but it doesn't work. And there seems to have been a different mutation that caused guinea pigs to not produce vitamin C. So my conclusion is common descent, at least, is consistent with this evidence. There's many other examples you should read. Daryl Falk's book, or Rats, the guy running the NIH anyway. The books are recommended, and they'll give you a lot more information. So there's retroposons, there's short interspersed elements. The bottom line, viral insertions, so a very rare event, is a virus will insert a piece of DNA into a fish or into a strawberry. And you can look at these, and you can see different species that appear, like, for example, lions, tigers, cheetahs, and you'll notice all of them have this one viral insertion. And yet, say, hippopotami do not. These kinds of things. So you can start to create a map based not on physiology, anatomy, or fossils, but on DNA. And the thing is, the DNA map of the relationship between species is similar but not identical to the map that was created from anatomical or physiological information. All right, for example, gene codes for proteins, humans and chimpanzees are 99.5 or greater similarity. With dogs, we have 99%, mice 99%, chickens 75%, fruit flies 60%, roundworms 35%. All right, so therefore, the general genetic evidence is consistent with common descent. Does that prove it? No, it doesn't. I believe personally God has intervened at different times for different reasons of his own making. I'm not going to argue with God on that. But statisticians and people look at evolution, the number of mutations required are in the billions. And mutations that produce a positive effect are incredibly rare. So could fully natural processes explain the entire range of living species? Personally, I believe not. I believe God had to have intervened. All right, so there you go. Some tentative conclusions. Evolution has happened. Microevolution has been observed, as, for example, viruses. Coronavirus evolves. Fossil evidence supports the idea of change over time, but change often happens surprisingly suddenly. Cambrian explosion raises some real questions. Genetic evidence, on the other hand, is even more strongly in support of the idea of common descent. This is true of humans as well. Statistical arguments raise a lot of serious questions. God invented evolution. Let's just give him credit. All right, now I want to talk about God and science. Oh, I haven't left enough time for this. I want to talk about the evidence for design. The anthropic principle, which says the laws of nature are what they are, and the fundamental constants which underlie them have the values they have for one reason and one reason only, in order that advanced life forms such as humans can exist. In other words, the only answer to the question why, what do I mean by that? Why does anything exist at all? Why the product chart? Why the element properties? Why, the force of gravity? Why the nuclear strong force? Every single fact about the physical universe can be given, the answer to the question why can be given by this one idea, which is they were created so that we could exist. It's the only formative concept that can answer the question why. And so, these facts have emerged mostly in the last 30, 40, 50 years, which is interesting. Because science seemed to have sort of taken humans out of the center of things. So, we were the center of the universe. And then science says, well, no, actually the sun is. And then science says, well, no, the galaxy. And then science says, well, actually just one of billions of galaxies. We're this tiny, tiny speck on a tiny, tiny thing and a tiny, tiny thing and a tiny, tiny thing. We're nothing. But now science seems to be saying, yeah, that's true. Physically, we're small. But actually, everything about science says we're the reason for everything. Let's talk about some details there. I don't have time for the different kinds of anthropic principles. Atheists say, where much of the product of blind forces as the falling of a stone to the earth or the ebb and flow of the tides, which just happened. And man was made flesh by a singularly beneficial series of accidents. I believe that atheistic naturalist idea is nonsense, that it simply doesn't hold water. That the only way to even begin to imagine to explain the facts of science is to accept the obvious, that God created the universe not just randomly so that we could exist. I believe the atheist explanation of natural law is untenable. It's bizarre. It's not rational. Richard Dawkins, in a universe of blind forces and genetic replication, some are going to get hurt, others are going to get lucky, no rhyme or reason, no justice. There's at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Really? All right? DNA neither knows nor cares. It is, and we dance to its music. And again, I believe that this philosophy is flawed, that it does not explain the facts. I believe the facts strongly support the idea of design. And design cannot be measured. It can't be quantified. It's questionable whether the idea of design is even scientific. And yet, this thing is design. If you think this is the result of a singular beneficial series of accidents, I would say you need to have your head examined. And when we look at nature, the evidence for design in nature is far greater than the evidence for design for this clicker. Okay, that's the watchmaker argument, if you will. Finely tuned universe. All right, this is a small number, 59 zeros and then a 1. And it turns out the facts of the Big Bang are that in order to use the Big Bang model to explain the origins of the universe, the size of the gravity force has to be fine-tuned to an insane precision. Because if the gravity force had been larger than it is, by that fractions on the screen, if it had been larger, the universe would have collapsed back on itself almost as soon as it was created. On the other hand, if the force of gravity had been weaker than it is, by a fraction, roughly that size, it would have expanded forever and galaxies and stars and planets would not have formed. So let's just imagine, first of all, why does gravity even exist? Can science explain that? It absolutely cannot explain it. Can atheists explain why we have gravity? No, they have absolutely no rational answer to that question. All right, so let's assume that it exists. Why does it have the value it has? I mean, the probability that gravity, assuming it exists in the first place, that it would have the proper value to allow for life as we know it to exist would be like winning the big lottery 6 times in a row. And I'm telling you, if somebody won the big lottery 6 times in a row, they would be in jail. If they won it twice in a row, they would be under serious suspicion. I believe the fallacy of atheism is contained in that number right there. The thing is, if that was the only example, gravity, dominant force on an astronomical scale needed to produce a stable universe, if it was weaker by this tiny part or larger by that tiny part, the universe simply would not work. Gravity is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60th. The thing is, it's not just gravity, it's the ratio of electrons to protons. Electrons are created through one process, protons are created through a different process, and yet they're balanced to something like 1 part in 10 to the 30th. Why? And I'm telling you, if they were not balanced to that level, then we wouldn't have molecules. We would have, we could talk about the strong nuclear force, the nuclear weak force, the electric force, the expansion rate. There are literally dozens of parameters that define how the universe works. We know that by observing them. Some of them are fine-tuned to 1 part in 10, others to 1 part in 20, others to 1 part to 10 to the 30th. If we combine all these together, we produce a probability of random accident. Numbers that are they're so small they're not even meaningful. There's strong force, which holds the nucleus together. 5% weaker, only hydrogen. 5% stronger, no hydrogen. Either way, no life. Weak force, we could talk about that. Electromagnetic, many other things. I don't have time for this. All right, the summary on fine-tuning would be, even if you just talk about, say, 5 different parameters, 1 part in 10 to the 100th fine-tuning. And the number 10 to the 100th is more than the total number of particles in the entire universe, with 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion or more stars. All right, this is irrational. The idea that the universe is not intelligently designed it just doesn't work. That's where the multiverse idea came from, right? The multiverse idea is not science. It is an ad hoc hypothesis created for one reason and one reason only: to save the idea of randomness, of lack of purpose, to defeat the strong anthropic principle. There is no evidence for any other universes than our own, and there's no way to test that theory. We talk about the right kind of galaxy, the right kind of solar system, all these other things, so many things. We go on and on and on. All right, and we could talk about the properties of water. Okay, life needs a solvent. Now, that solvent has to have certain properties. First of all, it has to be a liquid. You can't form life based on a solid or a gas. That makes sense. So you need something that's liquid. Physicists and chemists would tell you that compound has to be a liquid, somewhere in the range from around minus 20 centigrade up to about 80 centigrade. Beyond that range, molecules fall apart. Below that range, there's not enough energy for life reactions to occur. And water happens to have a boiling point, a temperature being a liquid almost throughout the whole range, but it turns out there's essentiality to it freezing in part of that range, as we'll see. Okay, now in order for a solvent to support life, it has to be able to dissolve a wide range of molecules. It has to be able to dissolve what we call nonpolar, polar, ionic. The only liquid between minus 20 and 80 degrees centigrade that dissolves ions, the only one is water. All right, and if water did not dissolve ions, we wouldn't have a nervous system. Life can't exist without ions. All right, water dissolves a broader range of molecules than any other liquid in the universe at any temperature, never mind at the required temperature. And yet water doesn't dissolve everything, because if it did, we'd be a puddle. Another property of water is water absorbs far more heat than any other substance, 3 times more than virtually every substance, and more like 10 times more than almost all substances. And water has a very, very high specific heat. And if it didn't, the temperature of the earth would go up and down by 200, 300, 400 degrees centigrade in any given year, and life would not exist. So the same molecule that has the correct boiling point properties also has the correct solvent properties, also has the correct heat absorbing property. Another bizarre thing about water is every other compound other than water and the element bismuth, which is not a compound, has the solid sinking and the liquid floating. Solid is colder, liquid is warmer, solid sinks, liquid floats. The only exception amongst compounds is water. Why is that important? Because in the winter, otherwise, what happens is in the winter, the colder ice stays on top of the warmer water. Ice is a thermal non-conductor. Water is a thermal conductor. Otherwise, the lake freezes to the bottom. And during ice ages, the oceans freeze to the bottom and bringing to a stop the creation of advanced life forms as we know. We talk about the viscosity of water, many, many other facts. The bottom line is you could teach an entire 1 semester course to explain the properties of water and why it has it. And every single one of those properties is unique to water. And if water didn't have that property, there'd be no life. We're talking about elements in the periodic chart. There's at least 22 elements that I know of personally which have a property unique to that element. No other element has it. And if that element didn't have that property, there'd be no life. A good question is, why are there so many different elements? Explain that to me. Give me an answer to that question. Why? All right, well, why aren't there even more elements? The number of elements is a fine-tuned property. Carbon is one example of a very well-designed element. I teach organic chemistry. When I do, I spend the first couple of days, the first couple of lectures, discussing the properties unique to carbon. No other element has it. Every single one of those properties, if carbon didn't have those, and by the way, the one element has to have all those properties, not just one of them, all of them. All right? If carbon didn't have those properties, there'd be no life. For example, if you look at the periodic chart, only the elements on the right form molecules, and only carbon and silicon, arguably, forms molecules with 4 bonds. All right, at least simple molecules. All right, and why is that important? Because in order to have 3-dimensional molecules, you need to have 4 bonds. And without 3-dimensional molecules, you don't have 3-dimensional life forms. All right, now silicon also forms 4 bonds, but if you combine 2 silicon atoms into the same molecule, that molecule immediately explodes or decomposes. All right, so you got that. And also, not only is carbon the only one that forms the correct number of bonds, it's also the only element that forms large molecules. The only one that forms single, double, and triple bonds, and we can go on and on and on. Every single property necessary to an element in order to be the framework for forming molecules for life, carbon has them, no other element does. Evidence for design. It's about iron. We go back to the periodic chart. Fe, iron, kind of in the middle of the chart. Iron is the only element that forms a strong magnetic field. Why is that important? Well, it turns out if the Earth did not have a strong magnetic field, then the solar wind, if you will, would destroy all life on the Earth, unless it's maybe deep underneath the ground. Why is that important? Well, okay, otherwise there'd be no life. And the magnetic field of the Earth literally creates a force field, literally. And you can see in the picture how a small percentage of that solar wind actually hits near the North and South Pole. That's why you get the Aurora Borealis. Now, here's the thing, is if you look at the periodic chart, now, they talk about the stability of elements has to do with the number of protons and neutrons. That's a scientific thing. turns out the most stable element from the point of view of its nucleus is iron. Why is that important? Well, if that weren't true, then the only magnetic element, iron, would be a tiny, tiny fraction of the Earth and wouldn't work. But it just so happens that the Earth is made out of more iron than anything else. So it just so happens the most common element in the Earth is also the magnetic element in the Earth. If both of those were not true simultaneously of the same element, there'd be no life on the Earth. Atheist says, accident, just luck. I would say that that is not true. It doesn't make sense. Okay, we can talk about the properties of oxygen, the properties of uranium. Without uranium's radioactivity, there'd be no recycling of the Earth's surface. There'd be no atmosphere because uranium causes plate tectonics. The heat released by the uranium causes plate tectonics. It just so happens that uranium has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, which is roughly the age of the Earth. And if the uranium had all gone away, then there'd be no more plate tectonics. There'd be no more atmosphere. There'd be no recycling of the Earth's surface. There you go. DNA. DNA is the most incredibly, amazingly designed substance in the universe. And it's not like there's competing molecules for doing the job that DNA does. DNA is this molecule that contains a code. The A, G, C, and T's there are these nucleotides. And those 4 letters are codes. 3 of them combined is a code for a particular amino acid that's used to synthesize a particular protein. Now, could molecules randomly bumping into each other by accident over time create a code? I would argue that this idea is not rational. It's not reasonable. And the amount of information contained in the DNA in the simplest life form, humans have between 2 and 3 billion of these pairs, nucleotide pairs. The simplest life is less, bacteria more like 100 million. Let's imagine the simplest conceivable model for something you could even call alive that has the properties to take in nutrition or reproduce. Let's say 25 million base pairs. The amount of information contained in this randomly assembled, accidentally bumping into each other molecule thing would be like taking 25 million letters, throwing them in the air, and then when they land on the ground, you could read it. It would have information you could actually use for something. I'm telling you, nature never creates information. Unless information already exists, you cannot get new information. The idea that the original life containing DNA and proteins self-assembled, I believe, is not credible at all. And there exists no believable scientific theory. And I believe it's not even believable that there could be a believable scientific theory for this. Life was created. Now here's the interesting thing. Proteins do all the work of the cells. DNA just contains the information. But it turns out the only thing that makes DNA is proteins. And the only thing that makes proteins is DNA. So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg, except on steroids. All right. And by the way, what made steroids? That's another question. Ha ha ha. Okay. So in other words, what the atheist believes is by some incredible accidental series of events, the DNA that would make the proteins just sort of happened at the same time in the same place as the proteins that would have made the DNA, but it didn't because it was there because in that original life, the DNA didn't make the proteins. And the protein didn't make the DNA. They both got accidentally created, and they were for the same molecules. You know, science says there is a God. There is a single, unchanging, powerful God of the entire universe. All right, Fred Hoyle. The chances of higher life forms might have emerged by chance is comparable the chance of a tornado going through a junkyard and making a Boeing 747. I agree with that. Nature creates order, but it never, ever creates information. Okay? Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen. He understood what is made so that men are without excuse. Did we just happen? Okay. I don't have time to discuss scientific materialism. I only want to go about another 15 minutes. Well, let me just give a really brief go at this. See, this is this philosophy. Most scientists do not agree with scientific materialism. A small majority, but a majority, believe in some sort of supernatural creator. All right? But there's this vocal minority of scientists who, in your face, say this: only that which can be observed and measured through the technique of the scientific method is real. Everything else is not real. Scientism is the acceptance of scientific theory and scientific methods as applicable in all fields of inquiry: religion, morality, ethics, art, religion. Here's Richard Watt. We exist as material beings in a material world, all of whose phenomena are the consequence of material relations among material entities. In a word, the public needs to accept materialism, determinism, which means that they must put God in the trash can of history where such myths belong. Now, I'm going to challenge that view as being not credible. If materialism is true, then I don't exist. In other words, if materialism is true, then all we are is a sack of chemicals. Then when you say, I want to go to the store, that's a meaningless concept. When you say to your significant other, I love you, what you should really say is, I neurotransmitter you. I mean, in fact, I don't exist. Sack of chemicals that we call me, has this release of hormones that's telling, but it's not actually true because love is not an actual thing. It's just, seriously. If it's true, then life has no value. Life has no purpose. Or if it has a purpose at all, it's to create as many copies of our DNA as possible, which could be the excuse for all kinds of things that I believe would be immoral, such as rape or incest, in order to create as many copies of the dominant gene that we're trying to have here. If materialism is true, then love is just chemicals being released. There is no such thing as love. There's no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as morality. There's no such thing as justice. There's no such thing as free will. All these things that we inherently know are real, they're not real if this is true. So naturalism or materialism is basically based on faith, not on evidence. It's demonstrably false, and it's really bad and dangerous philosophy. It's based on circular reasoning. All right, as an example, there's a BBC broadcast that says recent. When I made that slide, it's probably about 10 years ago now. They had an atheist and a theist kind of being interviewed by a panel of media people and smart people. The atheist came in and he essentially said what Richard Lewontin said. He said, the only things that are real are things that can be measured and observed through science. All the other things, consciousness, morality, justice, these aren't real things. They're epiphenomena. And the interviewer asked him, well, how do you know that? Well, religion is stupid. What about the Crusades? What about all these radical fundamentalists? And the panel says, sir, we asked you a question. Please answer it. How do you know that? Blah, 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 religion. And, this is just a bunch of myth. You might as well believe in fairy tales. And they stopped and they said, sir, the way this works is we're the panel. We ask you questions. You answer them. You told us the only things that are real are things that can be measured. And we asked you, how do you know that? He said, I guess I just believe it. Materialism is not consistent with the facts of the universe. They're not consistent with the facts that the universe was created from nothing. They're not consistent with the fact that life was created from non-life. It's not consistent with the insane level of fine-tuning in the universe. And even the materialists, if you ask them, they'll say, that's wrong. You can't do that. You shouldn't do that. Not right. Even the materialist believes in the morality that their materialism doesn't support. All right, so I wish I had more time on that to talk about the danger of materialism. If materialism is right, justice is meaningless. The word ought and should need to be taken out of our vocabulary. There's no such thing as wrong behavior. All right, last topic in the next 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes. Again, scientists in general have tended to attack biblical Christianity because it's completely out of line with science. My response to that is this. Really? Give me an example. I was in a van, probably 12, 13, that's quite a while ago, with a bunch of science professors at a meeting, and one of the ladies said, the Bible, how ridiculous. I don't know how anybody could believe in that. Said, in the book of Leviticus, it says, if you have clothing of 2 or more materials, capital punishment on that person. And I interrupted her. I said, excuse me, that's not true. And she said, oh, yes, it is. I saw it on the website. Well, there you go. And so I said, I've read the Bible cover to cover multiple times, and I've never seen a single statement in the Bible related to science that's inconsistent with the Bible. So I don't know what people are talking about when they say that. Then I pulled out my Bible, and I said a quick prayer. I found that verse in Leviticus about 2 materials. It does not mention it does not mention capital punishment. See, people say this stuff, and yet I think they haven't read the Bible. There are many things in the Bible that seem to point towards science. Excuse me, I have to go away for roughly 90 seconds here because my computer's about to run out of power. So sorry, everybody. Give me about 60 seconds. Pretty funny. All right. Okay. So anyway, here's let me finish the story. So I'd say let's not be intimidated by these, smart-sounding materialists who argue that the Bible and science are in radical disagreement, because I don't agree with that at all. I don't know of a single statement in the Bible which is proved wrong by what I know from science. Don't know of any. Here's Papyrus Ebers, which is sort of like a physician's desk reference in ancient Egypt from roughly 1500 BC, same time as Moses, more or less. Papyrus Ebers is a compendium of medical knowledge of the ancient world. Some would say Egypt, maybe China had the most advanced sort of semi-useful medical knowledge at the time. Papyrus Ebers has prescriptions such as this mixture of 6 fats: horse, hippo, crocodile, cat, snake, and ibex to prevent hair loss. Some of the drugs used to cure disease in Papyrus Ebers included lizard's blood, swine's teeth, rotten meat, and even excrement, even human excrement as medicine. This, we could think of this as humorous, but to me it's tragic. Average lifespan was 20 years or less, not because people couldn't live to be 60 or 80, but because almost everyone died from some kind of infectious disease for which there was no cure, nothing offered. And yet the Bible seems to be the exception to the rule. In Exodus 15:26, it says, if you will follow the laws I'm giving you today, the diseases that these other people have, you will not have. All right. And the Bible does not have things like human excrement or pig's ear stuff for disease. In fact, it has things like this: pig, unclean; cow, clean; fish, clean; crustaceans, unclean. Now, it just so happens that everything on that don't eat list contains many, many diseases. Pork has more than 20 known diseases, many of them fatal. Beef, fish with scales, safe, even relatively safe raw. Other shellfish, many, many diseases. So everyone on the don't eat list is relatively dangerous. Everyone on the okay to eat list is relatively safe. All the other peoples ate all these things. Clear evidence of scientific wisdom in the Bible. That one example, proof of the Bible, I don't know. That one thing, you could argue that maybe Moses got lucky or something. But then there's other things, such as the treatment for when you touch a dead body. When you touch a dead body, it says you take hyssop, ash, and water, and you clean inside and out, not only the person that touched the dead body, but the things they touched the first day and the seventh day, and then they're clean. All right, Semmelweis worked in a Vienna hospital where the death rate for women was 20%. And when he basically said that when we touch a dead body, we need to clean our hands thoroughly with soap and water, the death rate went down to 4%. And then he said, even between female patients. By the way, the Bible says even when a woman's in her period or gives birth, she's also unclean. Think about it. When is a woman most susceptible to receive infectious diseases? All right, and then when they did those two ideas, both founded on what we could argue are biblical instructions, the death rate fell down to less than 0.5% in the hospital. Germ theory. The Bible doesn't talk about germs. But the Bible, the Old Testament, has many prescriptions, if you will, which, if followed, will prevent the spread of infectious disease, which includes, by the way, the prescription was ashes, hyssop, water, and the hyssop plant is very oily, which creates the soap, if you will, along with the ashes, but it also has a very high proportion of thymol. And thymol is a very powerful antibacterial substance. So the treatment for cleaning a dead body and things they touch, and was to essentially clean that person's entire body twice with a powerful antibacterial soap. Further evidence of scientific wisdom in the Bible. And we could talk about leprosy. The Bible gave a prescription which when first applied in Europe in the 15th century, led to the annihilation of leprosy in Europe. Quarantine. Okay, life is in the blood, the Bible says. And yet early, in the Western world, bloodletting. They said the disease is in the blood. The Bible says the life is in the blood. Medical science says the disease is in the blood. We now know who was right about that. And even circumcision itself. Circumcision, which prevents many, many kinds of sexually transmitted diseases. The spread of AIDS is reduced by more than 50% simply if the male to female transmission of AIDS is prevented by more than 50% by male circumcision, which is why in many countries in Africa, they're encouraging male circumcision where they didn't used to do that. And then what about the 8th day? Well, it turns out when a child is born, they have no vitamin K at all and very little prothrombin, which is the protein responsible for causing the clot. Baby's born, baby gets bacteria from eating from mommy. The bacteria in the gut produces vitamin K. Prothrombin levels drop from modest levels to near zero over the first 3, 4, 5 days of life. But then because of the bacteria in the gut, the vitamin K levels go up, and so does the prothrombin. So the safest day from the moment of birth to the moment of death to circumcise a male child is somewhere around the 8th day. And that's a very quick version. The bottom line is there is deep scientific wisdom in the scriptures. Talk about cosmology, biblical cosmology, which doesn't exactly prove the Bible, but it strongly supports the reliability, the scientific reliability of the Bible. I do not have time today to talk about the scientific errors, Hinduism, which says the universe is eternal, Buddhism, which agrees that the earth is eternal, Islam, which has some obvious scientific errors in it, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get back to our, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to go to the chat. Again, I went so fast. I covered so much material. I'm sorry about that. All right. But, okay, let me see. I have to get back to it. Okay, there we go. Good. So I'm going to go to the chat, and I'm going to see if there are any questions. All right. Aha. Yes, thank you, Evelyn. Todd, I've heard from young Earth creationists stating the reference to Mount St. Helens eruption and fossilization of artifacts there support the appearance of age theory. I've heard that, but it's just not true. It is not true that materials fossilize within just a few hundred years. And besides, I mean, there are examples. Now, it is true that under very radical conditions, certain kinds of things can fossilize within just a few years. Okay. Now, that's not true for the formation, say, of petrified forests. All right. St. Helens didn't produce petrified wood. That takes many, many thousands of years. All right. And the fact that certain kinds of fossilizations occur in a fairly short time does not prove the Earth is young. That is not evidence the Earth is young. That's just a smokescreen. And besides, does that explain why it is that we have the fossil record, which shows fossils whose age appears to be 300 million years old are always below fossils whose age appears to be 200 million years old, which are always, without an exception, below fossils which appear to be 100 million years old, etc. And the fact is that we don't get dinosaurs in any rock formation less than 65 million years old. They don't exist. And there's the whole bird thing, but we won't go there. So, all right. The fact that, what young Earth creationists want to do, they want to take a single isolated fact and create the false impression that says the Earth is young. The fact that certain kinds of fossils form within only a few years, scientists have always known that. That's not new information. That's not information that does not in any way whatsoever support the idea that the Earth is young. Because I'm telling you, if you take that fossilized rock and measured its age, it would say its age is a few years old. So, all right, explain the connection between uranium, plate tectonics, and the atmosphere. Okay, great. Sorry about that. I was going so fast. Okay, there's very, very little uranium in Mars, which explains why Mars crust doesn't, there's no geologic evolution happening in Mars, or virtually none. There's no volcanism in Mars. And the fact that there's no volcanism in Mars is why there's also no atmosphere on Mars. It's also why the surface is sterile. All right, so the bottom line is, if the Earth were, the reason the Earth is still hot in the middle is because of the radioactivity of uranium. Uranium is a very heavy element. And because it's very heavy, almost all of it is in the center of the Earth, lucky for us, because there it can produce the heat without producing the radioactivity that's going to destroy life. So that heat very, 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 very gradually emerges from the center of the Earth over the millions of years, creating these convection currents, which causes, continental drift, which also recycles the elements so that the elements essential to life, which would be essentially used up by living things, are constantly being reintroduced. And it's also why we have an atmosphere. In other words, gas is released from inside the Earth. it replenish the atmosphere over time. Okay? And if it weren't for uranium having this radioactivity, we can predict with great confidence that if the Earth were 4.5 billion years old and there was no plate tectonics, then there would also be no life. The radioactivity of uranium is essential to life. That's the point. All right. Anonymous. The only evidence of God is the Bible. How do we... I didn't say the only evidence of God is the Bible. Far from it. What I argued is that science very, very, very strongly supports, to the point of practically proving that there's a designer, that there's a powerful single God. Let me finish reading the question, though. Let me see. If the only evidence of God is the Bible, how do we say the Bible is true due to the fact that the Bible is locked up in the Roman Pope's custody? All right, there's so many false ideas in this question. Forgive me for saying that, but the Bible is never locked up. You're probably talking about the Codex Vaticanus. There is a particular Greek manuscript of the Bible, the Codex Vaticanus, which is a very early Greek manuscript from the 4th century. All right, but the fact is, the Bible has been available generally to people since the very beginning. That has always been the case. At any point in time, 100 AD, 200 AD, 500 AD, there were tens of thousands of Bibles. All right, and the Roman Catholic Church has never had control over the Bible. There was the Greek Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, and the idea that one person could somehow control the Bible flies in the face of everything we know from history. So let's just propose, but there was no such thing as a Pope before about the 6th century anyway. But let's say that there was a Pope in the 6th century. Let's say Pope Gregory wants to change the Bible. Well, first of all, he's using a Latin Bible, not even using a Greek Bible. And besides, who's the main people using the Greek Bible? It was the Orthodox Church, the Church in the East. Good luck, Pope Gregory, getting the Church in the East to agree to change the Bible. Some people have said at the Council of Nicaea, they changed the Bible. I'm sorry, but that is ridiculous. That proposal is ridiculous. Because we have manuscripts from before that time. And we have thousands, literally thousands of quotes from the New Testament from before the Council of Nicaea. And so if you want to change the Bible, you'd have to change all those quotes and all those manuscripts, some of which are already sitting somewhere to be discovered, 1,800 years later. So the idea that somehow the Catholic Church controlled the Bible is crazy. And besides, whoever said the only evidence for God is the Bible? I certainly didn't say that. I would say from science alone. Now, I'm not saying you can prove Christianity from science. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. Science supports Christianity. I gave you a bunch of information from the stuff about leprosy and all that. Science supports Christianity, supports the creation account, all that. But the fact is, science, independent of Christianity, very, very strongly points towards the existence of God. Okay? How is it that for hundreds of years there was no contact between humans, and that there is so much physical verifiable proof of the existence of the Spirit? I don't understand this question. It's going from Aaron Anthony. Oh, rats. For hundreds of years, there was no contact between humans. I don't even know what that's talking about. I'm so sorry. Verifiable proof of the existence of the Spirit. Anthony, or is it Aaron? We're going to go live on a Zoom in about 10 minutes. And I'm going to want you to come to that live Zoom to ask that question, because I don't understand the question. Sorry. All right. Roland Ernst, do you think that evolution from one-celled life to humans could be possible without God's invention? No, I don't. I don't believe that. Now, there are scientists who are also Christians who propose that is what happened. They propose that God was so intelligent and powerful that he set up a thing which he could envision just boom, 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 humans. I don't believe that. I believe that the evidence from things like the Cambrian explosion points to intervention. I believe the kinds of of mutations that would have had to have happened to have this entire chain of events. It's not believable. That's my opinion, but people I respect as believers would say that it could be true. So, Roland, to your question, to me, as a scientist with a degree, a PhD in chemistry and physics, who studied evolution in great depth, blah, 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 I believe that it is not possible that the simplest life form, just through random events and mutation and, survival of the fittest, could produce what we have. But there are people that I respect who think it could have. The Bible doesn't answer the question, so we're left saying, I would say, I don't know. My opinion is definitely not, but that's my opinion. What's the best way to help a Christian struggling with the validity of Scripture in light of scientific evidence? Take this class. Even better, get a copy of my book, Is There a God? But I've also suggested two other books. One is The Language of God by Francis Collins, and Coming to Peace with Science by Daryl Falk. Also Signature in the Cell. I believe if you read reputable scientists such as myself, and Francis Collins is level up for me, honestly. If you read reputable scientists discussing what the Bible says and what science says, I think you're going to find this idea that they're inconsistent is simply not true. In fact, what you're going to find is your faith in God is going to be significantly deepened. I would say scientists have more reason to believe in God than any other class of human beings. All right, so the best way to help a Christian struggling with this is to ask them to read the Bible and then read the book by scientists such as myself, Is There a God, IPI Books, and others, and then just think for themselves. So I don't agree with Francis Collins. Now, by the way, Daryl Falk helped Francis Collins put together The Language of God. I've met Francis Collins. I've talked to him very briefly, and whether or not Francis Collins believes that it's a fully natural process, I don't know. I know Daryl Falk because I've sat down and had lunch with him, and I presented to him this idea that the statistical arguments. And by the way, Daryl Falk knows a lot more about evolution than I do. That's what he's a professor of. Daryl Falk agrees with me that almost without question that God has in fact intervened at different times for different reasons in order to produce the final product. He's a good friend with Francis Collins. Francis Collins has a strong relationship with BioLogos, as does Daryl Falk. I can't speak for Francis Collins. I think Francis Collins tends pretty strongly towards that fully naturalistic view of evolution. I don't strongly disagree with him. I would say if that's true, then I would say I disagree with him for both theologic and scientific reasons, but I wouldn't bet my life on it. I appreciate Francis Collins for many, many reasons. And please don't create this idea that we're in strong opposition to each other. But the answer is yes. I disagree with Francis Collins on that. All right, let's see. Contacts between Jesus and humans. Well, Jesus was a human. And so Jesus had a lot of contacts with humans. The Word of God became flesh, and he dwelt for a while among us. Come to the worship at the Bakersfield Church of Christ tomorrow online at 3:30, and we'll talk about that. All right, let's see. Roman emperors. I don't know about that. All right. Again, anonymous. We're gonna have to talk, face to face. 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, we're going to go to that Zoom. All right. Let me see if we got a couple other questions down here. Let me see. All right. Oh, those are the only questions. Hello, Shane from Whidbey Island. Hello, Tina from Scotland. I've met Tina, I believe. Hello, Ajit from India. Andreas, great. All right, so we now have about 30 people left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the Zoom address. for those who are interested, I'm going to close down this event. Thanks for coming, by the way. It's great. Hope you enjoyed it. I did. It's kind of tough not having interaction. So I'm going to close the event, and I'm going to open up immediately a Zoom session for those of you who want to come. We had about half a dozen last week. It was fun. If not, thanks for coming. I'll see you around. Keep coming to my website. We'll put on some other webinars. Thanks to Paul, who's probably not here anymore. Thanks to Paul for sponsoring this. And I think I'm going to open up the Zoom even as I'm still talking here. All right. Here we go. Yeah, so it'd be great to hear from you, especially Mr. Anonymous. I don't want to blow off your question, but I just didn't understand it. Usually I understand questions when I hear them. But that one I just simply didn't understand. All right, great. The Zoom meeting is now open. Feel free to come over. Great. All right, everybody. I'm now turning off the webinar. Anyway, I'll hope to see some of you over there at Zoom. Actually, did the Zoom address show up in the chat? Where is it? Hi, Donna. Hi, Marlene. Yeah, there it is. 342-225-5971. Great. Let's see if anybody's at the Zoom. Not yet. It will be soon. All right. So I'm going to wait one more minute, and then I'll close down the webinar. Goodbye.